In the year 2600 BCE, give or take a few decades, an Egyptian pharaoh named Menes was stung by a wasp. According to the hieroglyphic record carved into his tomb, that single sting killed him. The ruler credited with unifying Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom, brought down by an insect smaller than his thumbnail. For centuries, historians assumed the account was exaggerated. A political assassination dressed up as an act of nature, a myth inflated over generations of retelling. What nobody knew at the time was that Menes may have experienced something millions of people deal with today: anaphylaxis, a catastrophic allergic reaction that can shut down the human body in minutes. And if that is true, then the oldest recorded death from an allergy happened over 4,600 years ago. That single detail changes the way we think about allergies in the ancient world. Because if a pharaoh could die from a wasp sting in 2600 BCE, that means allergic reactions were not some modern inconvenience. They were killing people long before anyone had a word for them. Long before antihistamines, before EpiPens, before anyone understood what an immune system even was. So how did ancient humans deal with allergies when they did not know what allergies were? The answer stretches across continents and millennia, from the Nile River Valley to the mountains of ancient China. And some of what they figured out was so far ahead of its time that modern medicine is only now catching up. To understand how ancient people handled allergies, you first have to understand what they were actually seeing, because they did not have the word allergy. That term would not exist for thousands of years. A Viennese pediatrician named Clemens von Pirquet coined it in 1906. So ancient physicians had to describe what they observed, without any framework for immune response, without any concept of histamine, without antibodies or mast cells, or any of the biology we take for granted today. And yet they described it remarkably well. The Ebers Papyrus is one of the oldest and most complete medical documents ever found. It was written in ancient Egypt around 1550 BCE, and it contains over 700 remedies for everything from crocodile bites to depression. Buried inside that massive scroll are detailed descriptions of a condition that sounds almost exactly like asthma: wheezing, shortness of breath, chest tightness that worsen during certain seasons. The Egyptian physicians who wrote it recommended inhaling herbal vapors heated over bricks, including mixtures of frankincense, honey, and specific dried plants. They would place the herbs on hot stones, cover them with a pot that had a reed sticking out of the top, and have the patient breathe through the reed. Think about that for a second. Nearly 3,500 years ago, doctors in Egypt essentially invented a primitive inhaler. They did not know about bronchial inflammation or smooth muscle constriction. They just noticed that certain people had trouble breathing, that it got worse at certain times of year, and that inhaling certain plant vapors seemed to help. That is observational medicine at its finest. The Ebers Papyrus was not the only Egyptian text that addressed these conditions either. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Hearst Papyrus also contained references to respiratory complaints and skin eruptions that sound suspiciously like eczema and contact dermatitis. Egyptian physicians categorized these conditions alongside other afflictions caused by what they called the influence of hostile spirits or the wrath of specific gods. The treatments, though, were surprisingly practical. For skin reactions, they applied pastes made from aloe, animal fat, and ground minerals. For nasal congestion, they blew crushed herbs directly into the nostrils using a hollow reed. They even recommended avoiding certain areas along the Nile during flooding season, when particular plants bloomed in dense concentrations and breathing problems spiked among the population. What is remarkable about the Egyptian approach is how systematic it was. These were not random folk remedies passed around campfires. They were written down, organized by condition, and passed from physician to physician across generations. The tradition of empirical medical observation was already alive and functioning in the Nile Valley more than 1,000 years before the Greeks claimed to have invented it. But Egypt was not the only ancient civilization wrestling with this problem. About 1,000 years after the Ebers Papyrus was written, a Greek physician on the island of Kos was making observations that would reshape medicine for the next 2 millennia. Hippocrates, widely credited as the father of Western medicine, noticed something strange about cheese. Specifically, he noticed that cheese made some people violently ill while others could eat it without any trouble at all. This might sound obvious to us now. Of course, some people react differently to foods, but in the 5th century BCE, this was a radical observation. The prevailing understanding was that foods were either good or bad, healthy or poisonous, and the effect was universal. If a food was harmful, it was harmful to everyone. Hippocrates challenged that entire way of thinking. He documented cases where patients broke out in hives after eating certain foods, where their skin became inflamed and itchy, where their stomachs revolted against meals that their neighbors ate without any issue. He did not call it an allergy. He called it an idiosyncrasy, a Greek term meaning a peculiarity of the individual. That distinction matters enormously because Hippocrates was essentially saying that the problem was not in the food. The problem was in the person's unique reaction to it. That is the fundamental insight behind all of modern allergy science, and a Greek doctor figured it out nearly 2,500 years ago. Hippocrates also documented what we would now recognize as seasonal allergies. He described patients whose symptoms flared at specific times of year, who sneezed and wheezed when certain plants were blooming, and who improved when the seasons changed. His treatment recommendations included dietary changes, avoiding specific environments during peak symptom periods, and various herbal preparations. He was not just observing allergies, he was already trying to manage them. Around the same time in history, another tradition was developing its own approach to allergic conditions on the other side of the world. Traditional Chinese medicine had been evolving for centuries, and one of its most important contributions to allergy treatment involved a scrubby little plant called ma huang, known in the West as Ephedra. Ancient Chinese physicians had been using Ephedra to treat breathing difficulties, nasal congestion, and chest tightness for at least 2,000 years before Hippocrates. Some records suggest its use stretches back over 5,000 years to the legendary emperor Shen Nong, who supposedly tested hundreds of herbs on himself and catalogued their effects. Whether Shen Nong was a real person or a mythologized composite of early herbalists, the tradition he represents identified something genuinely important. Ephedra contains ephedrine, a compound that relaxes the airways and reduces congestion. It works because it mimics adrenaline, opening up the bronchial passages and making it easier to breathe. This was not a lucky guess. Ancient Chinese medical texts describe the specific symptoms that ma huang was meant to treat, the proper dosage, the way to prepare it, and even the side effects of taking too much, including racing heartbeat and restlessness. Modern pharmaceutical companies eventually extracted and synthesized ephedrine from the same plant in the 1920s, using it as the basis for some of the first commercial asthma and allergy medications. 5,000 years of traditional use, and the chemistry backed it up completely. That is not a coincidence. That is validation on a civilizational timescale. But the ancient understanding of allergies went beyond individual remedies. Some civilizations developed entire philosophical frameworks for why certain people reacted differently to their environment. In ancient India, the Ayurvedic medical tradition built an elaborate system around the concept of doshas, 3 fundamental body types that determined a person's physical constitution, temperament, and susceptibility to illness. The 3 doshas, vata, pitta, and kapha, each carried their own set of sensitivities. A person with a dominant kapha constitution was considered more prone to respiratory congestion, mucus buildup, and reactions to damp environments and heavy foods. A pitta-dominant person was more likely to develop skin rashes, hives, and inflammatory reactions. Vata types were thought to be sensitive to cold, dry conditions and sudden environmental changes. Now, this is not modern immunology. The doshas do not map neatly onto antibody responses or mast cell activation. But the underlying principle is strikingly similar to what allergists observe today. Different people have different immune tendencies. Some are prone to respiratory allergies, others to skin reactions, others to gastrointestinal sensitivities. Ayurvedic medicine was reaching for a concept that would not be formally described by Western science for another 2,000 years. The idea that immune response is deeply individual, shaped by genetics, constitution, and environment. Ayurvedic practitioners also deployed a pharmacy of anti-inflammatory herbs that have stood up surprisingly well to modern scrutiny. Turmeric, which contains the active compound curcumin, was used extensively for inflammatory skin conditions. Neem leaves were applied to rashes and itchy skin. Licorice root was prescribed for sore throats and respiratory irritation. Triphala, a blend of 3 dried fruits, was used for digestive sensitivities. Modern research has shown that curcumin does have significant anti-inflammatory properties, that neem contains compounds with genuine antihistamine effects, and that licorice root can soothe irritated mucous membranes. Ancient Indian physicians did not understand the biochemistry, but they noticed what worked and kept using it. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Romans were developing their own perspective on individual sensitivity. The poet and philosopher Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BCE, made an observation that has become one of the most quoted lines in allergy history. He noted that what serves as food for one person can be bitter poison to another. That line, written over 2,000 years ago, captures the essence of allergic individuality more cleanly than most modern textbook definitions. The great Roman physician Galen expanded on this idea considerably. Working in the 2nd century CE, Galen developed a comprehensive theory of human health based on the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these humors fell out of balance, illness followed. Galen observed that some patients had excessive phlegm production, leading to congestion, runny noses, and breathing difficulties that worsened in spring. Others had an excess of yellow bile, which he associated with hot, inflammatory reactions like rashes and skin eruptions. His treatments aimed to restore humoral balance through diet modification, herbal medicines, exercise, and environmental changes. Galen was meticulous in his case records. He documented patients in Rome who could not tolerate certain grains, others who developed facial swelling after eating specific fruits, and soldiers stationed in foreign provinces who developed breathing problems they never experienced at home. That last observation is particularly interesting because it suggests Galen was noticing what we would now call geographic or environmental allergy triggers. A soldier from the dry plains of North Africa might never have encountered the particular tree pollens blooming in a damp Germanic forest. His immune system was meeting something entirely new, and it was overreacting. Was the humor theory correct? No. But Galen's actual treatment recommendations often worked despite his flawed reasoning. Telling a patient with springtime congestion to avoid damp environments, eat warming foods, and drink specific herbal preparations would have provided genuine symptom relief. The theory was wrong, but the observations driving the treatments were right. This pattern repeated itself across the ancient world. Practitioners stumbled onto effective treatments through careful observation, even when their explanations for why those treatments worked were completely off base. The medieval period carried many of these traditions forward, though it also added its own layer of superstition. European monks preserved Greek and Roman medical texts in monastery libraries, while Islamic scholars translated and expanded upon the work of Hippocrates and Galen. The Persian physician Rhazes, writing in the 9th century CE, produced what many scholars consider the first detailed clinical description of hay fever, distinguishing it clearly from the common cold based on its seasonal timing and the absence of fever. He called it rose fever because he noticed the symptoms appeared when roses bloomed in Persian gardens. That observation was 1,200 years ago, and it is still essentially correct. Perhaps the most fascinating example is ancient honey therapy. Multiple cultures, separated by thousands of miles and with no known contact, independently discovered that eating local honey seemed to reduce seasonal allergy symptoms. Egyptian physicians prescribed honey mixtures for respiratory complaints. Greek healers recommended it for throat irritation and coughs. Chinese, Indian, and later medieval European traditions all included local honey in their allergy treatment repertoires. The specific ways these cultures used honey varied. Egyptian healers mixed it with milk and ground herbs to create throat-soothing pastes. Ayurvedic practitioners recommended a spoonful of raw local honey each morning as a seasonal tonic. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates himself, prescribed honey mixed with vinegar for persistent coughs. In China, honey was combined with ginger and licorice root to treat what traditional texts described as wind cold invading the lungs, a condition whose symptoms match allergic rhinitis almost perfectly. For a long time, modern scientists dismissed all of this as folklore, just another old wives' tale with no basis in reality. Then researchers started looking more carefully. The theory behind local honey therapy is that bees collect pollen from the same plants that trigger seasonal allergies. Small amounts of that pollen end up in the honey. By consuming local honey regularly, a person ingests tiny doses of the allergens they are sensitive to, gradually desensitizing their immune system over time. This is essentially the same principle behind modern sublingual immunotherapy, where patients place drops or tablets containing small amounts of allergen under their tongue to build tolerance. Clinical trials on honey and allergies have produced mixed results, some showing a modest benefit and others showing none. But the concept behind it, gradual exposure to small doses of allergen to reduce sensitivity, is one of the most validated principles in modern allergy treatment. Ancient beekeepers and healers arrived at a crude version of immunotherapy thousands of years before anyone understood IgE antibodies or T-cell regulation. But all of this raises a question that researchers have been arguing about for decades. Did ancient humans actually suffer from allergies as much as we do today? And the honest answer is almost certainly not. The evidence strongly suggests that allergies are far more common now than they were in the ancient world. And the reasons come down to how dramatically human life has changed. Our ancestors lived in close contact with soil, animals, parasites, and a staggering diversity of microorganisms. Their immune systems were constantly busy fighting off real threats: worms, bacterial infections, waterborne parasites, insect-borne diseases. A body occupied with genuine dangers has less capacity to overreact to harmless substances like pollen or cat dander. This is the core of what scientists call the hygiene hypothesis, proposed by epidemiologist David Strachan in 1989. The idea is straightforward. Modern humans live in environments that are vastly cleaner than anything our ancestors experienced. We have antibiotics, sanitized water, sealed homes, processed food, and dramatically reduced parasite exposure. All of that is great for preventing infectious disease, but it also means our immune systems have less to do. And an idle immune system is a twitchy immune system. Without real threats to fight, it starts picking fights with harmless proteins in pollen grains, pet fur, peanuts, and shellfish. A closely related theory focuses specifically on parasites. For most of human history, virtually every person on the planet carried intestinal worms and other parasites. These organisms evolved to suppress certain aspects of human immune response to keep themselves alive inside their host. In doing so, they dampened the exact type of immune overreaction that causes allergies. As societies eliminated parasites through sanitation and medicine, that immune suppression disappeared and allergy rates climbed. The geographic evidence supports this. Populations in developing countries, where parasite exposure remains common, have significantly lower rates of asthma, allergies, and autoimmune conditions compared to populations in industrialized nations. Studies of immigrant families show that allergy rates increase within a single generation after moving from a high parasite environment to a low parasite one. The children born in the new country develop allergies at rates matching their adopted homeland, not their parents' homeland. There is even evidence that the types of allergies ancient humans did experience were different from what we see today. Food allergies, for example, appear to be overwhelmingly modern. Peanut allergies, tree nut allergies, shellfish allergies, at the severity levels we see in 21st century populations, are almost entirely absent from ancient medical literature. You would expect at least some mention if children in ancient Rome were dying from eating walnuts. The silence is telling. Ancient physicians documented food sensitivities, yes. Hippocrates wrote about cheese reactions and Galen noted grain intolerance. But the life-threatening, send you to the emergency room food allergies that dominate modern headlines appear to be a product of the industrialized immune system, not a timeless feature of human biology. Respiratory allergies, on the other hand, do show up consistently across ancient sources. Seasonal sneezing, congestion, and asthma-like symptoms were clearly common enough to warrant detailed medical attention in Egypt, Greece, China, and India. This makes sense. Pollen existed long before humans did, and some level of immune overreaction to airborne particles was probably always part of the human experience. The difference is one of scale. Where ancient communities might have seen a handful of people in a village struggling with spring congestion, modern cities see entire populations reaching for antihistamines from March through June. So ancient humans likely had some allergies, enough to be noticed and documented by physicians across multiple civilizations. But the scale of the problem was nothing like what we see today. The very same advances in hygiene and medicine that extended human lifespans and eliminated countless diseases also, paradoxically, created the conditions for allergies to flourish. Given all of this, what can we actually take away from how the ancients handled allergies? More than you might expect. And this is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because when modern researchers started systematically testing ancient remedies in controlled clinical settings, they found something that surprised a lot of people. Some of these treatments did not just kind of work, they worked as well as modern pharmaceuticals. Not all of them, obviously. Ancient medicine had its share of useless concoctions and magical thinking. But a meaningful number of traditional allergy remedies passed the same rigorous testing that modern drugs have to clear. Start with butterbur. Ancient Greek and Roman physicians used the leaves of the butterbur plant for respiratory complaints and headaches. Modern clinical trials have shown that butterbur extract can be as effective as cetirizine, one of the most popular antihistamines sold today, at relieving seasonal allergy symptoms. A Swiss study gave participants either butterbur extract or cetirizine for 2 weeks during peak pollen season. Both groups showed equivalent improvement. The ancient doctors did not know why butterbur worked. We now know it contains compounds called petaceins that inhibit leukotriene synthesis and block histamine release, essentially doing the same thing a modern antihistamine does, just through a different chemical pathway. Stinging nettle is another ancient remedy that has held up under scrutiny. Used by European herbalists for centuries to treat sneezing, runny nose, and itchy eyes, stinging nettle has been shown in laboratory studies to inhibit several key inflammatory pathways involved in allergic response. A 1990 study at the National College of Naturopathic Medicine found that more than half of participants rated freeze-dried stinging nettle as moderately to highly effective at relieving allergy symptoms. The irony is hard to miss. A plant that causes an itchy, stinging skin reaction on contact turns out to contain compounds that reduce allergic reactions when ingested. Ancient herbalists had no explanation for why a plant that hurt your skin could help your sinuses. They just knew it worked, so they kept prescribing it. Centuries later, we figured out the biochemistry and confirmed they were right. Then there is quercetin, a flavonoid found in foods that were staples of ancient diets. Onions, apples, grapes, berries, and capers are all rich in quercetin, and these foods appeared regularly in the dietary recommendations of Greek, Roman, and Chinese physicians for patients with inflammatory conditions. Modern research has shown that quercetin stabilizes mast cells, the immune cells responsible for releasing histamine during an allergic reaction. In laboratory settings, quercetin is one of the most potent natural mast cell stabilizers ever tested. When ancient physicians told allergy sufferers to eat more onions and berries, they were prescribing a natural antihistamine without knowing it. Even the basic environmental management strategies used in the ancient world hold up. Hippocrates told patients to avoid certain areas during blooming seasons. Ayurvedic physicians recommended dietary changes to reduce mucus and inflammation during high pollen periods. Chinese doctors prescribed warming teas and steaming herbal inhalations during damp seasons when respiratory symptoms worsened. None of these practitioners could explain why these strategies worked at a molecular level, but every single one of them identified genuine triggers and offered advice that reduced exposure and managed symptoms. The story of how ancient humans handled allergies is not really a story about primitive people fumbling in the dark. It is a story about observation. Careful, patient, sometimes brilliant observation carried out over thousands of years by physicians who lacked modern tools but possessed something equally important: the willingness to watch, to record, and to test what worked. They noticed that certain people reacted differently to the same food. They noticed that breathing problems followed the seasons. They noticed that local honey, inhaled plant vapors, specific herbs, and dietary changes could provide relief. They built entire medical systems around the principle that each human body responds differently to its environment. And when modern science finally had the tools to explain why these things happened at a cellular and molecular level, it confirmed what ancient doctors had been saying all along. Allergies are deeply individual, rooted in the unique interaction between a person's body and their world. Today, roughly 1 in 3 people in industrialized countries suffers from some form of allergy. We spend billions of dollars each year on allergy medications, immunotherapy, and research. We have mapped the human genome and identified specific genes associated with allergic tendency. We have EpiPens and biologics and desensitization protocols that can retrain the immune system at a molecular level. All of that is extraordinary. But the foundation of it, the fundamental observation that what nourishes one person can sicken another, and that the body can be gradually taught to tolerate what it once rejected, those ideas did not originate in a modern laboratory. They came from Egyptian priests, Greek physicians, Chinese herbalists, and Indian healers who simply paid close attention to their patients and refused to ignore what they saw. The ancient world did not solve the allergy problem, but they understood it far better than most of us give them credit for. And in a world where allergy rates are climbing every year, perhaps the most useful thing we can do is look backward before we look forward. The answers have been there for a very long time. We just stopped asking the right questions. If this video taught you something new about how the ancient world dealt with health, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which ancient remedy surprised you the most. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next.